I am very grateful for the invitation to present the Simon Brand Memorial Address at your conference today. I'm going to focus on the theme of the conference, which is resilience to shocks, and talk about pivoting and co-pivoting in value chains for resilience to shocks from climate, disease, and market changes. To put the shock of COVID-19 in perspective, and as it's dominating a lot of thought about resilience in supply chains in these past few years, I want to think about COVID-19 as just the most recent of a cascade of shocks on agri-food value chains that have been faced by value chains over the past 2 decades. If you think about this as just a set of dominoes occurring, we had already 20 years ago the SARS outbreak in 2003 in China, SARS being COVID-1. And 20 years later, we have COVID-19 in 20 to 22. It's really continuing still, and this time affecting beyond value chains in China to affect globally, global value chains and domestic value chains. There were also a series of phytosanitary crises and regulatory shocks over the past 20 years. One example from the work by Reardon and others, I was also privileged to be on this paper in AgriCon, was the black spot disease in citrus in South Africa, and the European Union regulations that were really seen from the point of view of the citrus industry in South Africa as shocks to that industry, as shocks to the value chain that were addressed and managed and dealt with. Then there was a third set of shocks over the past couple decades, which is a series of animal disease crises and accompanying regulations. Very often the shocks are not just the crisis itself, but also the accompanying regulations. And we have an example of avian flu on Southeast Asian chicken. Of course, it also affected African chicken. In this talk, I'll be using examples globally, and not just in Africa, but I'll bring in African examples. A fourth set of shocks that have really risen in their visibility in the world news are the climate shocks that are intensifying, linked to climate change. And in the news all the time, we have one hurricane or another drought or a flood that are deeply affecting value chains around the world. And one thinks about the devastating hurricanes in Central America that are disrupting banana supply chains. A fifth set of conflicts that have really always been there, but really risen in visibility again in the news and in the actuality are internal conflicts such as the Boko Haram conflict in Nigeria, or obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine that's affected global supply chains for food. And a sixth set of shocks, which you don't think of as shocks immediately if you're thinking about COVID and climate and disease, but these are shocks to value chains, is simply the rapid transformation of domestic, regional, and global value chains. For example, consolidating supermarket sectors domestically as well as internationally, imposing challenging private standards, for example, on fruit and meat suppliers. And beside those 6 individual shocks coming in sequences and over time, there's often also a confluence of shocks, a coming together of shocks that pile onto each other, pummeling a value chain. And we've recently done 2 waves of surveys of 1,500 maize traders in Nigeria. And these are traders that are working along a 1,000-mile value chain of maize, really depending a lot on third-party logistics and on distant movement of maize from the north to the south. They're very vulnerable because of the length of the supply chains. And we've studied shocks that have been hitting them. And it's amazing, the set of these shocks that all come together on their backs. You have the COVID lockdowns. You also have the Boko Haram conflict. And in the past couple of years, a huge rise in road banditry. You have farmer-herder conflicts. They faced floods in one place and droughts in another. And at the same time, with all of that on their backs, they've had fuel price hikes. And so it's very often this way that you have a mass of shocks working together and testing the resilience of the value chains and individual players. So in this, even though there are a number of different lenses that one can use to think about resilience of value chains, I'm going to focus on one way of looking at this in this talk, and that's resilience, which comes from the pivoting by one segment of the value chain. Pivoting meaning a fundamental change in behavior, let's say by one segment, for example, the wholesalers, or let's say retailers, requiring co-pivoting by other segments in that value chain. For example, retailers that are needing to have co-pivoting by wholesalers or delivery intermediaries, or a whole value chain, let's say a product value chain that's pivoting to meet some new market requirement or weather some shock, and being assisted by the pivoting of a number of segments in another value chain. For example, a crop breeding value chain that I'll bring up in the talk. So this is the lens that I'm taking today in this address to thinking about resilience to shocks. And you can just think of some examples to get going. One is retailers in the past couple of years pivoted fundamentally into e-commerce during COVID. And co-pivoting with them were delivery intermediaries and logistics firms like Uber that retooled and began moving food for them and making it possible for them to quickly ramp up e-commerce. Another example is where processors pivoted to reconfigure and diversify their sourcing systems when COVID struck. And wholesalers and logistics firms co-pivoting to help them to roll out these changes in their sourcing systems. Also, another example is farmers pivoting to adopt new technologies. And let's think not just in the case of COVID, but let's say in the case of changing markets as a kind of shock. Farmers have had to pivot to adopt new technologies that comply with quality or safety or environment standards imposed by supermarkets and other processors and other kinds of large buyers. And you find in the examples I'm going to show that outsourced mobile harvesting and spraying and monitoring services, these agricultural services, have co-pivoted with farmers that needed to make these sudden large changes but didn't have the wherewithal themselves to make all of the moves because of some asset limitations. And these services have facilitated this shift of the farmers, co-pivoted to help them. The fourth example is farmers pivoting to higher quality or disease or heat resistant crop varieties and animal breeds. This is again with climate change as the shock. And what we've seen is that breeding value chains, animal breeding value chains, for example, or crop breeding value chains, have co-pivoted with the product value chain to create varieties and breeds with the needed traits to deal with these sorts of shocks. So these are just examples to set the stage for this idea of resilience as pivoting and co-pivoting. And third, in the introduction, we can think about the fitness of a value chain to be resilient to shocks via pivoting and co-pivoting. And that fitness is conditioned by several factors. And we've really seen this jump out at us in our research in the past couple of years on this subject. Policies and infrastructure really affect the transaction costs and thus the fluidity of actors in the value chains and also value chains themselves to pivot and co-pivot. An example that really struck us during the COVID studies is where the policies and infrastructure facilitated easy pivoting and co-pivoting, complementary actions along the supply chains. And this came out in the studies of China and Turkey, where good infrastructure and policy helped delivery intermediaries to rapidly develop in China and Turkey to help retailers pivot to e-commerce. On the other hand, we also found examples where policies or infrastructure costs, transaction costs, really held back players in the supply chains when they wanted to work together to adapt to shocks and change. An example in a paper we published in 2021 in Nigeria case is that during COVID, the Nigerian government declared as non-essential logistics services like truck movements. And this really gummed up the easy movement of trucks. But at the same time, the government declared retail and wholesale, for example, of maize, to be essential services. And because in our work, we discovered that the maize traders, only 4% of them owned their own truck. Of the thousands of traders, only 4% owned their own trucks. They depended very strongly on the third-party logistics, a subject that I think has been vastly understudied, and yet it's extremely important. And so declaring the trucking business non-essential strangled the retail and wholesale responses to COVID. And so this is an essential sort of example of where policies and infrastructure, et cetera, can hinder the reaction of actors in the value chain. The fitness of value chains to a current shock is very interestingly often a function of fitness built up over time for dealing with this cascade of shocks over time that I mentioned. Really, you could think of this in American English, we call it the school of hard knocks, meaning you're brought up fighting and you learn through the experience of fighting. And I learned this from Danny Jordan and Melissa van der Merwe and Ferdi Meyer for the case of South African citrus, where the experience and the needs that it imposed for organization and the Citrus Association and phytosanitary services on the part of the government and coordination among different players in the value chain. All of this, was induced over years by having to deal with changing requirements with respect to, for example, black spot disease in citrus imposed by the European Union. So as these changes and requirements of the market occurred, then the citrus value chains were making the investment, forming the needed responses, and thereby just getting a general ability to deal with various kinds of shocks. And that then we found in the research spilled over into the period of COVID, when COVID just appeared to be one more set of new protocols and new diversification of places you're selling to, and new kinds of pivoting and investments. It's just one new shock after a series of shocks that you're used to reacting to. And so I think that that was a fundamental insight that I learned from them. So with this idea that a way to look at resilience is to think of pivoting and co-pivoting of actors inside a value chain or between value chains, and this involving fundamental investments by actors, together, essentially co-investing. I want to give you some illustrations that I think are very exciting about how this has happened, and make a suggestion for further research on this kind of topic. And one that we published on in several places over the past couple of years was a case of downstream and midstream co-pivoting of the rise of e-commerce in China and India, for example, by retailers and restaurants. And so you can think of e-commerce rising not just during the COVID period, but over a decade or 2 decades in some cases, in the China case. And a lot of this trend just being accelerated by COVID, not started, but accelerated. And the initial shock where you had, for example, in China, Alibaba was only a business-to-business company. And it then, with commerce, with digitalized business-to-business operations. But when SARS or COVID-1 came in 2003, and there was a generalized lockdown of consumers, then Alibaba started its famous e-commerce business selling to consumers. So this has happened so often in the history of food value chains, where some crisis, like a disease crisis, accelerates change suddenly, okay? And you also had longer term drivers of the e-commerce rise in the form of urbanization and congestion and opportunity cost of shoppers' time, for example, women's time, that were pulling and pushing the supermarket revolution, for example, but also the e-commerce revolution. And then combined with that, you had it fed by digitalization technology, which was on the shelf already, so taken off and applied to commerce. And the resilience assets that were built up during this time in terms of entering the e-commerce was really very intense and rapid investment in e-commerce software and hardware. And that included an avalanche of foreign direct investment, for example, Alibaba into Southeast Asia, okay? And you also had that to a certain extent in Africa with Jumia investing in 7 different countries. So you had this movement of money in the same way that you saw in the supermarket revolution, where it turbocharges the spread of a new technique, which in this case is e-commerce. But also you had the resilience assets built up by the emergence of delivery intermediaries, like Instacart and other kinds of examples of firms that arranged with apps and sometimes with logistics the movement of the products from the retailer to the consumer. And so you saw real pivoting and co-pivoting success, for example, in the China and India cases, with extremely rapid acceleration of the diffusion of e-commerce and pivoting by logistics firms. For example, Uber, that was mainly moving people in passenger service before COVID, then with COVID, they shifted to logistics of also moving food, and sometimes in partnership with other delivery intermediaries to be able to facilitate the shift to e-commerce of retailers, especially retailers that were not the biggest retailers that might have had their own logistics. So you had the rapid growth of delivery intermediaries, especially to serve these medium-sized firms and sometimes smaller firms. For example, in Turkey, the Getir is a delivery intermediary that rolled out a service that specifically serves small and medium enterprises, SMEs, in e-commerce. A second example that I referred to a few minutes ago, and I've learned so much from my colleagues in South Africa, and within this paper last year or earlier this year published, we were looking at various pivoting and co-pivoting that took place in responses to the shocks in the beef and the maize and the citrus value chains in South Africa. And, I'll just be brief because I mentioned it a little bit already, but there was a cascade of shocks or drivers of the pivoting and co-pivoting. For example, as I mentioned, these disease events or perceived disease events, in a cascade of EU phytosanitary regulations, and retail changed private quality standards for fruit beyond disease and into the issues of quality. So these really pulled and pushed the industry to build up resilience assets. And some of the resilience assets were this pivoting and co-pivoting by exporters, by ports, by packing houses, and by farmers to deal with the cascade of shocks. First, these disease-related and private standards-related shocks, and then into the COVID-related shocks. Building up collective assets, which I've seen in various countries like Chile, also is so important for an ability to coordinate across actors to deal, to make decisions, to work together to do the pivoting or co-pivoting. And then this is the case with Chile also, and certainly the case in China, where private sector is, extremely important and held up as central to everything. And so the government's always trying to facilitate what the private sector wants to do. I saw that in China, in my long time in China, Chile, same mentality, and in South Africa, you've got this kind of link. The government's listening to the private sector and helping them to make the pivoting actions. And so you saw a success. You even saw in the citrus case, market share increasing during COVID because South Africa was more lithe, more flexible to react and do the needed pivoting during the COVID time. So the clouds, there were some clouds in the sky in what South Africa did, and the paper pointed this out. And very interestingly, it's a little bit similar to the Nigeria story, where you had some things called essentials, and then some things that were deemed non-essentials. And the non-essentials then were, in theory, things that you could impede or lock down and not really hurt the economy for a while and make way for more flexibility and movement of the essential sectors. So citrus was declared an essential sector because it's so important for exports. But the wood and forest products value chain was declared as non-essential at the beginning. And the paper pointed out that this then caused a problem of production of wooden crates for fruit packing. So the packing houses were slowed down. And so the harvest was slowed down and the value chain of citrus was slowed down. But again, because of these assets buildup of private sector government links and the collective assets of the association, there was really a monitoring going on and an understanding that, oh, when this limitation was observed, the wheels start to turn to eliminate that impediment and declare essential the wood sector and the wood value chain and get the wheels of the sector moving again. A third example that I think is so fascinating is pivoting between segments of the midstream. So if you think about the midstream being processing and wholesale and logistics, then in the case of Thailand, there was a fascinating co-pivoting of rice milling and export on one hand, for example, by Chatham-Popcorn, which is one of the biggest agribusiness firms in the world, often called CP, and logistics firms. And so you had a fascinating situation where this giant company working at an Asian level and a world level was constantly under the pressure of all kinds of shocks, typhoons or the hurricanes. You had the bird flu, you had policy shifts with food crises. And so CP being a big company and having, for example, the largest rice mill in the world in Thailand, built up a system of redundant ports. I just love this example where the guy explained that they have a port on the ocean and then they have a port inland and a port further inland on the river, so that if the ocean area is washed away or the second one's washed away, they have a third port ready and waiting to catch, the incoming or outgoing business. So this redundancy is often used in the business school literature as a way to assure resilience. It's expensive. So what this, of course, means, and we emphasize in the paper that I did with David Silverman, is that when you have this kind of resilience bought through redundancy, the large players get stronger, and the weak players that can't afford to buy multiple units of the same thing essentially then are pushed out, okay, or at least when the next risk wave rolls in, they're hurt, and then maybe they're pushed out. And also CP then work to diversify their sourcing so that they're not counting only on certain areas, even within the country. For example, in their operations in China or in Thailand, they explained that they compartmentalized their supply chains. So they would be able to sort of turn off like a submarine, close the valve and seal shut one compartment of the submarine so it doesn't flood if the side of the submarine is gashed, and then the rest will float. So they thought of the value chains in the same way. They would maybe stop one state or province and then reroute the supply chain around through other states or provinces and save the whole ship. And of course, they were forging relationships with logistics partners to be able to make these moves. So during COVID, this sort of company like CP had a lot of success pivoting. Shifting a little bit away from the issue of COVID shock or climate shock, and really thinking of markets transforming as really forming a kind of shock to suppliers, we can give the example of fruit value chains that have to pivot with changing market requirements, in breeding value chains, co-pivoting to make it possible for them to do so. And we've done a recent paper looking at shelf life and taste requirements required by supermarkets that sort of translated into new varieties of blueberries, and blueberry growers and breeders that were linking with those two actors to be able to create varieties with the needed new traits. So again, using the same little model I have here, mental model, you have a cascade of shocks. You have a demand trend that's intensified by retailers' needs with COVID for its shelf life. Okay, so the retailers are already wanting fruit that has better and better shelf life. And then COVID, with its uncertainties among many retailers, increased their desire to be able to have fruit and other products that had better shelf life. So they were not stranded with perishable products that went bad when glitches occurred in the supply chain. And also there was a trend building up over time to use proprietarial varieties of fruit for quality differentiation. So in a product cycle, you're moving from a commodity to a differentiated product, and more there was proprietarial varieties of fruit used for this purpose. So a fascinating set of what I could call resilience assets were built up in a triangle we describe in the paper. For example, on one side of the triangle, one corner of the triangle, you have breeding firms like Fall Creek Nursery in Oregon that has worldwide operations now. It started as a little breeder a couple decades ago and then expanded worldwide. And they would be creating new blueberry varieties. They would have grow out or multiplier operations in a number of countries, distributors in a number of countries. And so they can really work up the needed varieties. And then you had a second group, which were the grower, packer, shippers that might be collaborating with a set of outgrowers, and they're adopting the variety. And then the retailer that wants to have the new variety to be able to have differentiation of product. And you can see the economics of this, where the breeding firm doesn't want to go out on a limb and take a risk and produce a new variety that won't have a set of strong farm groups that are going to adopt it and produce it at scale. And by the same token, neither of those want to produce something that's not going to be bought by retailers, especially in economies where 10 or 15 supermarket chains, like in the US, control 80% of the fruit that's bought. I mean, when you think about it, in many European countries and in the US and other advanced cases of supermarket penetration, 10 or 15 procurement officers are in charge of 80 or 90% of the fruit that's bought for hundreds of millions of people. So you have this funnel, right? And so you want to make sure these guys want these new varieties. So there's a lot of risk involved. But the resilience asset that then occurred was the creation of a cascade of new varieties to meet these requirements, and therefore pivoting and co-pivoting success to adjust to the market needs. Really, a very similar thing has happened in the cattle value chains. And I'm just starting to work on a paper on this with Greg Graff of Colorado State University and David Silverman again of UC Berkeley, looking at cattle value chains having to pivot and how cattle breeding value chains are co-pivoting. An example is disease and heat resistance requirements that cattle farmers have in Brazil as they scale up quality production. So again, in a little model here, you have the cascade of the shocks with the demand increase for quality beef by both domestic and international processors. Even though Brazil has the biggest beef companies in the world, 80% of the beef produced in Brazil goes to domestic consumption. Just like in South Africa, 8% of the beef produced in South Africa is exported. So, you have 92% is domestic. So you have this kind of dual market, but in both of the markets, you had a rise of the demand for quality. But at the same time, you're coupling it with this situation of climate change in Brazil, where you have increased heat. So there's a demand for breeds that can both be good meat and resistant to the heat. So the resilience assets that were built up in this value chain, or the set of value chains in this case, was the value chain of breeding, in this case dominated by, or the case that I'm studying of a breeding firm called Neogen that happens to be based in Michigan in the US, but is present in many countries now. They're breeding cattle that are more resistant to the heat, and they're in partnerships with Brazil Cattle Producer Association. So, and they've done that in Canada too, and other places where they're working together to be able to breed for success in facing the shock of the climate with the demand for quality of the market. So again, there's been a cascade of new breeds, produced in this situation. Then finally, there's a set of, to me, absolutely fascinating pivoting and co-pivoting going on between farmers and what I think are very understudied upstream outsourced mobile services. These are, services that are serving farmers to help them to do what they need to do, and it goes beyond just farmers being able to hire workers, et cetera, but really deal with enterprises that have a bunch of solutions for them. And one example is in mangoes in Indonesia. Here you have a cascade of shocks and drivers again, an increase in demand in the domestic market because they aren't exported for quality mangoes. A lot of changes we've seen in the world are driven by the domestic markets and not by the international market. Okay, everybody always thinks the international market is the thing that drives the changes, but I would say 90% of the changes going on are from domestic market change, like urbanization. Also, there's been an increase in the asset threshold of skills and equipment investment necessary for mango farmers to be able to make these adaptations. And at the same time, though, the farmers are facing increasing personal opportunity costs of time because they're very much employed in rural non-farm employment. So they don't have time to do all the things necessary on their farms, and yet they need to make these moves. And at the same time, they need to make them in a cost competitive way because there's cost pressures from competition for those urban markets. So again, there was a buildup of resilience assets for pivoting and co-pivoting with a triangle again of outsourced mobile services firms, which are called sprayer traders because they're spraying and they're harvesting and they're also wholesaling the stuff, the mangoes. And then you have the mango farmers second, and you have the retailers and urban wholesale markets third. So these services are providing A to Z services for the mango farmers. So again, you have this pivoting and co-pivoting success. Another fascinating example is the work by Bart Minton and colleagues on vegetable farmers and upstream outsourced mobile services in Ethiopia. And here again, you have a cascade of shocks. Demand trend in the domestic urban market for quality and all-season vegetables. It's really driven by the demand only in the urban market. It's not for export. And at the same time, you have an increase in the asset threshold of skills and equipment investments like pumps and spraying and many kinds of things necessary to make the vegetable business. And so there's been a cluster that's emerged in Ethiopia that serves the Addis Ababa market. And there again, you find this triangle. Outsourced mobile services firms that are coming in and performing various services like the land preparation or putting in the pumps or harvesting. And then you have on the other side a set of medium-sized vegetable farmers, not small farmers, that are in a cluster and are demanding these services. And then on the third point of the triangle, you have urban wholesale markets that want a constant supply of these products. And a final case is in France with large farmers and upstream outsourced mobile services co-pivoting to produce eco-certified vegetables, eco-label vegetables. So you have again a cascade of shocks, demand trend toward wanting those eco-certified vegetables by both supermarket chains and by consumers. But to do that and reduce the pesticide and do the monitoring and do all of the reporting and recording, there's a big asset threshold of skills and equipment investments in, for example, drones to monitor large areas of production. At the same time, there's been a rise of gigantic vegetable farms with many outgrowers. In a couple of these cases, just a couple of the cases together equal 40% of the demand of vegetables in France. And, so these are big players, and they're producing eco-label vegetables for the giant supermarket chains that are wanting to really roll this out as a supply. And all the time, they're under the other pincers of cost pressure from competition among supermarket chains and penny counting but eco-demanding consumers. So again, you have this resilience assets buildup of a triangle of outsourced mobile service firms, which they call A to Z services. You have a second set, which is the huge vegetable farms, and a third set, which are the huge retailers. So they're all working together to do this co-pivoting. So to wrap up, and I said I would finish at most by 45 minutes of speech, and I'm at 41 minutes, which is surprising to me because usually I take too long and get too excited and talk too much. But the conclusions that I offer you is I think that there's a big interest in, and really a research gap in, research on resilience of value chains based on this pivoting and co-pivoting of segments within a value chain and also across value chains. And I think this kind of research allows the combination of agricultural economics value chain research with business management studies. So really, I think, potentially great interest for many agricultural economists, both in your association and globally. So I want to thank you so much for hearing this, and wish you well.